Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I am Kristen P. Cole. I'm the Assistant Director of ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom. First, I just want to do a little housekeeping. During this webinar, I'll be asking a few questions of our panelists and facilitating the discussion. At any time, submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and share your thoughts and experiences in the chat box. Towards the end of our hour together, I'll share your questions with the panelists for them to respond. You can also follow the conversation on Twitter with hashtag #BannBooksUncensored. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording link with all of the registrants, and it will be uploaded to our OIF YouTube channel. This webinar is second in the Banned Books Uncensored series that takes a deep dive into the frequently cited reasons why books are challenged to prepare library workers for future censorship attempts. The most cited reason for challenging library materials and services is because of LGBTQIA+ content. Of the top 10 most challenged books in 2019, 8 were challenged because of this reason. The questions we're going to ask in today's webinar, Banned Books Uncensored, LGBTQIA+ stories, and gender identity, is how can library workers challenge conservative groups that frame these books as harmful to minors or sexually explicit, and instead highlight these titles as inclusive stories of acceptance? What resources are available to support library workers when facing attempts to censor LGBTQIA+ books and authors? Now let me introduce today's guests. Sarah Kate Ellis is the president and CEO of GLAAD, the world's largest LGBTQ media advocacy organization. She leads GLAAD's advocacy to accelerate acceptance of the LGBTQ community through compelling and effective campaigns and programs. Most recently, Sarah Kate spoke on LGBTQ issues at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Prior to GLAAD, Ellis was an award-winning executive who grew and transformed brands, including Real Simple. Stevie Lewis has been living on the road in a van she mostly built herself for the past 3 years, furthering her passion for art and the outdoors. Striving to live simply and tread lightly on the earth, she gathers inspiration from a variety of places and enjoys rock climbing, hiking, and mountain biking. After working for several years at DreamWorks Animation Studios, Stevie now illustrates children's books and creates art based on her travels. Her latest illustrated work includes Prince and Knight by Daniel Hack, Lost in the Library by Josh Funk, the Finding Serendipity series by Angelica Banks, Sun, 1 in a Billion by Stacey McNulty, and Stacey's upcoming book, Moon, Earth's Best Friend. Deborah Caldwell-Stone is Director of ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom and the Executive Director of the Freedom to Read Foundation. She's a recovering attorney who works closely with librarians and library trustees and educators on a wide range of intellectual freedom and privacy issues. Deborah frequently speaks to library workers and library organizations around the country on law, policy, and intellectual freedom. Shannon Oltmann is an associate professor in the School of Information Science at the University of Kentucky. She obtained her PhD from Indiana University. Her research interests include information ethics, censorship, intellectual freedom, public libraries, and privacy. Shannon is the editor of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy on the editorial board of Library Quarterly, and she recently published a book titled Practicing Intellectual Freedom in Libraries. Stephanie Beverage is the Director of Library Services for the City of Huntington Beach, California, Surf City, USA. She has been in library administration for over 20 years, working in public libraries all across Southern California. Stephanie is an active member of ALA and PLA, and she is the current chair of the PLA Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships Committee. She loves wine, cats, college football, and her husband, John, who is an avid 3D printer. Tom Taylor is the director of the Andover, Kansas Public Library. Previously, he was a consultant at the South Central Kansas Library System. He has also worked at public and academic libraries in Kansas and Florida. Tom holds an MLIS from the University of South Florida. He is the past president of Wichita Area Library Association and the Rotary Club of Andover. He lives in Wichita with his 2 sons. I am Kristen Pico. At OIF, I am usually the first contact for librarians and educators who experience censorship. I started my career as a youth librarian in West Bend, Wisconsin, where I survived a book challenge to over 80 LGBTQIA+ young adult books. Last year, I published Beyond Banned Books, Defending Intellectual Freedom Throughout the Library, with ALA editions. In my free time, I love watching the Green Bay Packers and working on jigsaw puzzles. So thank you everyone for joining us. My first question is for Sarah Kate. Sometimes censorship challenges to LGBTQIA+ titles are led by very vocal groups with a large social following. Do you have advice for frontline librarians who are dealing with these social media campaigns that target the library?
Well, thank you all for having me. I feel honored to be in front of you all. I'm a big fan of libraries and books. I'm an avid reader. So, and I understand their power. So I want to demystify that for a second. Take, for instance, 1 Million Moms, who we've come up against quite often. They've gone after Disney. Most recently, we were going up against them with the Hallmark Channel when there was an advertisement that included a same-sex couple. There's actually less than 5,000 followers on social media for 1 Million Moms. So oftentimes I'll say, peel back, look behind the curtain and find out who's really behind this. It's usually just a handful of very vocal people. But that being said, it's still widely intimidating, and it can be very harassing and scary actually at times. One of the things that I tell people often is call us, call GLAAD, because this is what we deal with. We build out a campaign to help drown that out and bring the positivity of good storytelling, of important inclusive storytelling. And we can build kind of a moat around you in that moment of time. And I think often it can feel very isolating. We had an example of this with Princeton Knights in West Virginia, where they kind of went after the librarian in West Virginia, and we moved in very quickly and wrote pieces and published pieces nationally around why the book was so important. So we can help be your defense and your offense, honestly. And we're happy to do that. I think also is to have, at the ready, if you can, or quickly, is the voices that this affects. Because when you see a small child who is positively impacted by this, who has 2 moms, or who has 2 dads, or a kid who is going through transition or identifies as trans, and they can personalize it, how important this book is to them, why it matters, that often diffuses anything. As soon as you humanize it, it really tends to diffuse the backlash, if you will. So I oftentimes say, first and foremost, call us please at GLAAD.org, and that's 2 A's, and we're available. Everybody knows how to get in touch with us, and we're happy to help you. But also really look at who is coming for you, and look at what that means, because they're loud, but there aren't a lot of them. more people are on the side of acceptance. More people are on the side of equality than are anti it. It's just that sometimes they have loud voices and loud boxes. And oftentimes the media is attracted to that conflict, right? And that's the space that we work in, so we can help with feeding the media the right information, the truthful information, another narrative than the one that they will pick up. If there isn't another narrative presented, they will pick up the one that they have.
Thank you, Sarah Kate. That's great. And you kind of hit on a great point that, like you said, more and more people, this evolution has happened of understanding and cultural acceptance of the LGBTQ community. And we've seen that documented in several different types of media, but maybe not local media necessarily. And like you said, these organized groups have such loud voices, and they're the ones that attract the attention of local news organizations, especially on social media, and when anybody is willing to talk to them. Do you have any tips for librarians who do feel like they need to present their case if they don't have those the voices of the people that they represent documented very well? Any tips for librarians who are working with local media?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, we're happy to do a media training for your whole constituents, all of your constituents. We do that for a living. But I often say personalize it, tell your story. And that is what compels and moves people. So, for me, I have a wife, we have 11-year-old children. Their favorite book when they were little was Mom and Mommy. And so much so that they used to fight over that book, and we had to get a second one of those. It's a little picture book. It's not that. That's why it was so important for us to work on getting more stories out there, because I saw it in my own kids. I think also for librarians who are on the front line, when I tell you that there are local LGBTQ offices and community centers all over the country, they're in every town or every other town. So please reach out to them, and they can also provide you with some cover during this time. They can help you and support you as well. But I think that when you are talking with the media, never answer what they ask you. Tell them what you want to tell them. So for instance, and that's easy. It sounds harder than it is because we're all trained to answer the question that we're given, right? If I say, what's your name? You're gonna say, my name is Sarah Kate Ellis. But if you don't want to reveal that name, you might say, what is in a name, really? What's really important here is to talk about why books are so important. And that's sort of like a pivot. What's really important here is always one of my favorite lines, because no matter what they ask you, if they're trying to, because a lot of times they want to keep the controversy going. And what I recommend is saying, what's so important, what we really have to focus on here is that children have access to books that show them or reflect back who they are or who their family is. So I always say to answer the question you want asked, and think about that. Always go in with 2 points that you want to make, and you say them in 15 different ways. So your point might be that books are really important, and you might say the importance of books from a historical perspective, the importance of books from today, the importance of books in the future. But it's always about the importance of books. So I recommend finding what your soundbite is, making sure you say what you want to say, and just keep repeating it in fun ways.
That's such a great point, and I love that. I'm going to remember that forever. What's really important here line. I'm going to write that one. What's really important here. Tom, your censorship challenge to 3 LGBTQIA+ titles was one that made headlines. Could you share your story a little bit and what you might have learned from that experience?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm coming to you from Andover, Kansas, and it's an affluent suburb of Wichita. population quadrupled in 30 years, went from a small town to sort of a nondescript suburb. And a lot of people still maintain that small town attitude, thought they knew everyone, thought everyone was just like them. I received a communication from a local woman that she and her friend wanted to talk to me about concerns they had about some of the books in the library. They didn't say what it was, so I made sure I had our collection development policy and our materials reconsideration forms ready. I highlighted some specific things. One, that as a public library, we're not the parents, and it's not our job to determine what is appropriate for kids, and it's the parents' responsibility to check what their children check out. And also that as a public library, we are responsible for buying things for the entire community, not just the perceived majority. They proceeded to show me the 3 books that they were concerned with. Was I Am Jazz by Jazz Jennings, George by Alex Gino, and Lillian Duncan by Donna Gephardt. I told them I would review the books and get back to them, and so I did. And when I was looking at the books, I was primarily concerned with what's the target audience of these books. They wanted those books to get lost in the nonfiction or fiction section. And I read the books, and the target audience is children, and that's where those books belonged. And I told them that I was not going to move the books, and then I gave them the materials reconsideration forms. Well, they did proceed to challenge them. And so then we went through our procedure, and if you don't have a good policy or procedure, you need to start looking into that right after this webinar, because the process was really important. So follow the process. In our process, we had a committee that read the books and then discussed it and then voted. So the committee did that, voted to retain the material. So the woman who wrote the challenge appealed to the library board. We noticed on social media that it was getting mentioned that the topic of the library board meeting was going to be this challenge appeal, and there was a lot of mention. So we moved the event into our larger meeting room to accommodate that, and we had a full room. And we let people from the public out to speak, and people spoke from both sides of the issues, including local people that spoke in favor of it, including a local physician. There was a reporter from the local newspaper there, and he wrote a story. He met with the board afterwards, wrote a story. It hit the Associated Press. And as soon as it hit the AP, I got phone calls from some of the local TV stations. I got a call from a researcher at University of Southern Utah, and it just started spiraling. And so at that point, I felt I needed to write a memo to the community as to what had happened, what my opinion was, and what the next step would be. The board met the next month to announce their decision, and they made the decision to not have public comment because they'd already had a lot of public comment. We were getting lots of emails and phone calls. So they announced their decision. The vote was 6-1 to retain the books where they are. One of my board members reiterated the point that the only agenda that we have, the public library, is access. Access is our agenda, and that we weren't trying to promote a particular political point of view, but access to materials so people can make their own decisions was our agenda. Following that, I had a TV interview right after the meeting, and fortunately, the board president and vice president were on with me, and there was a lot of follow-up media. Also at that meeting, we had a hate group protest us, picket us. Actually, I think that was helpful because people know the Westboro Baptist Church as extremists, and people don't like them. And someone important to me said, if you are getting picketed by the Westboro Baptist Church, you're doing something right. I think it brought attention to the absurdity of some of these positions. But it was a long process. The woman wasn't done. She directly contacted the mayor and spoke up at a city council meeting, and you know, it took a very long time to deal with. I'm proud of how my board handled it. And the important thing all along is stick to your process and be able to demonstrate your values and articulate those values.
Wow, what an amazing story. I'm so sorry that you had to go through it, but you seem to have handled it with so much calm and grace. Did you find it to be incredibly, stressful at all for you, your family, or your colleagues?
It was stressful. It was a very stressful time. In fact, we had a recent staff meeting at the start of the year, and I was talking about my experience and how touching it was to have transgendered people speak to how they wish they had had access to those books when they were kids, and that was really important. And it was almost like I had PTSD, because I was very touched by them, but just the sheer amount of stress and there was a lot of hate. It took a lot of time. I wish I had calculated how much time I spent on it. I actually recently published a book chapter about it, which was good, but I don't know how much time I spent on it. So yeah, it was very stressful, but at the end of the day, I knew that I was doing the right thing, and that no matter what happened, I'd taken a stand, and that's what we professionally are supposed to do, and I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I hadn't done it.
That's very powerful. Thank you. Stevie, question for you. You're an illustrator of an award-winning book, Prince and Knight, published by Little Bee Books in partnership with GLAAD. In this award-winning book, a noble prince and a brave knight, I love the illustrations, come together to defeat a terrible monster and in the process find true love. The book was the #5 most challenged book in 2019 for LGBTQIA content. And for fear that the content would cause confusion, curiosity, and gender dysphoria. What was your reaction when you heard that Prince and Knight is among the most challenged books? And how has this affected your approach to future projects?
Yeah, I had no idea that any of this would happen. I just work in my room and I do my drawings and I submit them, and I never really know what's going to happen on the back end. Mostly, 99% of the feedback that I've gotten has been really positive. And I really thank everybody in this group here for all the work on the back end and having to maneuver these books and with these specific contents throughout the world, throughout our library system and school system and stuff. Like I would have never thought that that there would be reaction like what has happened from some of these districts, these conservative districts. I was really surprised. For me personally, it's not an issue at all, and it never, illustrating the book, I was like, this is great. There needs to be more stories like this out there. But when I heard the negative comments from West Virginia, I immediately was like trying to look up everybody and trying to see if I could contact anybody, and then I had to take a step back and just breathe for a second, because it's not necessary, it's not personal to me, so I needed to take the emotions out of it and just breathe for a second. But I was really passionate about how this book has impacted people, mostly positively, and I'm glad that some kids have had access to this kind of content. So
I just have a follow-up question for you, because I very intentionally chose not to go into any kind of art field, because I knew that it would be too personal for me to have my livelihood depend on art. Did you feel like that personal attack, that this was your artwork that people were complaining about or hating?
Not specifically for this one, because it wasn't comments towards the art. Specifically, it was more towards the, I guess, towards the idea and the writing of the book. So I didn't feel personally that way. And I've mostly heard such positive feedback from the book, even about the art. So, but I have had other books where they've specifically critiqued the art, and then, yeah, it's a little bit of a stab sometimes, but I'm kind of used to it by now at this point after working in animation, and things aren't really, it's a team effort at the end, and we're all in it together. So
yeah. Is there any anything you can share about your upcoming projects with us?
Yeah, turns out that I'm doing a sequel to Prince and Knight, and then it's going to be it's a different story than the first one, but it's a very beautiful premise, and I think everyone will like it who liked the first book. So, yeah.
Oh, fantastic! I can't wait to see it. Deborah, my next question is for you. One of the trends that we've observed in OIF is the growing number of bills in the states that have been that would establish parental oversight boards, which are parent groups that are given power to determine what's in a library's collection. These boards specifically look at whether or not materials are age appropriate, and this is a not so subtle way of attempting to remove LGBTQIA+ materials. What can libraries do to keep tabs on legislation in their state about the parental oversight boards or any other legislation that places library personnel at risk?
Well, the first thing to understand is that you can't prevent these bills from being introduced. For the last 18 months or so, we've been tracking the activities of a number of anti-LGBTQ groups and anti-sex ed groups, anti-porn groups, and they've actually come together to work in concert to develop these bills. And they're floating test balloons. The Missouri bill that was introduced this spring, along with the Tennessee bill that was introduced this spring, are both trial balloons. But what we've found is that the best defense is a good offense. You need to be willing to monitor the activities of these groups. And many of them are very open about their legislative agendas and their plans. For example, the Florida Citizens Alliance publishes their legislative agenda, and you can follow it to find out what they're planning to be introducing in the legislature. The other thing to do is to form good coalitions. Form coalitions with education groups, with library groups. When you have a strong coalition to support you, you can do almost anything. Particularly work with your state chapter. Almost every state chapter has a lobbyist that they work with who can inform you about what's going on in your state house and help you align what's going on among the legislators, who might be receptive to talking to you, who might not. Often these bills are introduced by legislators who are very firm in their beliefs, shall we say. And so you're not going to sway them, but you can sway committee chairs, you can sway legislators from other districts, and they need that support to get the bill through. Both Missouri and Tennessee found that they had worked very hard on developing strong relationships with legislators over a number of years prior to the introduction of these bills. And they had developed messaging that made sure that legislators throughout the state understood how libraries are essential, that the work of library workers, library volunteers is integral to the success of the community, both in an educational sense and both in a financial sense. And so building on that strong relationship, they were able to go to legislators and convince them not to support this legislation, even though their personal politics might have led them to do so. Another thing to do is to seek assistance from OIF and the public policy advocacy office's state advocacy manager. We have been through this with other states like Missouri and Tennessee. We can help guide you to other states that can support you and provide you advice on navigating this situation. and help you developing the messaging that you need. But ultimately, we found that the thing that needs to happen most, and it needs to happen before these bills are introduced, is sustained messaging that reframes this issue, that takes it away from the idea that these are inappropriate for minors or sexually inappropriate for minors, and promote them as diverse materials and programming that are about inclusion, fairness, and the protection of everybody's right to see themselves and their families reflected in the books in the public library. You know, I'll repeat this message. Tom has highlighted it. Sarah Kate has said some of these things too, but everybody the library belongs to everyone, and everyone is a taxpayer. And some of these false narratives that are introduced about how these books are being introduced by outsiders or people trying to corrupt children, particularly by advocacy groups like Mass Resistance, who has been very successful recently in trying to establish local chapters, by the way, to influence not only state legislation, but library policy. You need to challenge it right away. And GLAAD can help you with that. OIF can help you with that. There are tips that you can get from advocacy groups and professional associations that can help you.
Stephanie, my question is for you. You've dealt firsthand, again, with challenges to LGBTQIA+ titles. Could you share how your library responded to the challenge and any advice that you would share with library workers who may face similar challenges?
Sure. Earlier this year in January, we had I had a report of a challenge to a young adult teen title called Genderqueer, and we already had in place a policy and a procedure and a form for people to fill out if they wanted to question or ask for review of a title that was in the library collection. And we'd done training over the years with my staff, so they were all familiar with it. Some of my best staff were on duty when the challenger came in, and came in specifically looking for this particular title. And then went and found it on the shelf and then brought it to the attention of my staff person and essentially confronted my staff person very vigorously about the nature of this book and how she viewed it as being inappropriate, and it's pornography and it should be removed from the library. And so my staff they did what they were supposed to. They were well trained. It's like, yeah, thank you. They listened. They took down her information, they gave her the form, and they told her that they would let me know, the library director, that the challenge had been made and that there is a process, and someone would follow up with her and go through it, which is what we did. And like Tom said, you follow the process and you honor the process. And my staff learned, I think, as we went through this first challenge, that the process really made a big difference. I actually spoke to the woman who made the challenge and went over the process with her in detail on the phone. It was a very interesting conversation. She admitted in the course of the conversation that she was not a library card holder. She lived in our city, but she did not have a library card. She specifically came in that day looking for this title, because a group on social media had highlighted this as one of those titles that you should go and challenge and get out of your library. So we had an interesting conversation, and I talked about, we're in Huntington Beach, California. It's a big city. We're 200,000 people, 6 miles of beach. We're not far from Los Angeles. Orange County, California has traditionally been a little bit less liberal than the rest of California. But our community is changing, and the diversity here is increasing. And in fact, that's one of our initiatives that we were starting to talk about really getting into is equity, diversity, and inclusion for our collection. And I have a lot of new staff members that are on board that we've been working with to make sure that that's part of our collection development policy practice and what we offer to the community. And so we have more titles that represent everybody, And one of the things that I often use when I talk to people who express concerns about things, and what I used in the conversation with this first challenger was, one of my favorite statements is that if there isn't something in the collection that offends you, I'm not doing my job. Because the collection and the library does belong to everyone, all opinions, everybody in the community. There are things in the collection that I find offensive, but they're in the collection because they represent our community. Someone in our community relates to that. So the same thing works the other way. If you don't agree with something, just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't need it or want it. It's important, and it's important to represent everyone. So, we knew the person, this first challenger, had come in because she'd been on social media and involved with a group. So I was kind of anticipating what happened to Tom. Yeah, I was like, uh-oh, this isn't good. I have a new city manager, so I talked to him about it. I said, just so you know, had this person come in, going through the process, sending her a letter, and he was like, okay, that's great, do it, yeah. And so I was very pleased that he understood kind of, yeah, we have a process, this is what we do. So I was all geared up. And then after nothing came of that. But I reported it to the Office of Intellectual Freedom because it was a challenge that, you know, I was kind of like, okay, I don't know, there more might be coming. And I was right. In about a month, a second challenge came. And this time it was for This Day in June, which is a wonderful picture book about the Pride Parade in San Francisco. Yeah, it's done in rhyme, and the artwork is bright and it's happy, and yeah, and it's totally innocent and fun, and no way inappropriate for kids. And another parent came in and spoke to one of my young staff, my new teen librarian, who is not that far removed from library school and is all, was definitely all into increasing the diversity in our collection. And she had the process and had been trained, so she knew what to say and how to react. And we went through the process again. And then I spent a great deal of time with my new librarian, reassuring her that she'd done exactly what she was supposed to have done. She said what she was supposed to have said. The individual in question that was challenging this book clearly had issue with one page. There's a page where a few characters in the book are kissing. You really can't tell who's kissing who. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, but obviously she felt that this was, for, as she put it in her complaint, forcing this lifestyle on children. So again, we went through the process, reassured staff, training, told my city manager, hey, we started monitoring social media fairly closely. Huntington Beach can be challenging in terms of it's an active community. There are lots of people that are engaged on social media, on community platforms, and things can go off very quickly. And I was anticipating that this would happen, but I think our timing was good. Other things kind of pushed it out of the storyline, and there really was no, after that, we didn't have another challenge. But the process again really helped us. Staff knew what to do. I provided support, and we had talked about the first challenge. So when the second challenge came around, everybody was kind of geared and ready and looking and aware and thinking, okay, what's going to happen next? We should be prepared for the next stage. And so we had all of this lined up, and I talked to the Office of Intellectual Freedom. I talked to Kristen. I'd gotten some additional supporting material, and so we were all ready. And apparently, our letters, which relied heavily on what's available from the OIF, worked. I didn't hear anything back from either of our complainers, and so far we haven't had any additional issues. And social media stayed relatively quiet. So I was very happy about that. And very pleasantly surprised, honestly. So it really does help to have your staff trained and have a process and have policies, and then to talk to OIF. Kristen was great, and it was good to know that we weren't alone in having to deal with this, that this was a trend nationwide. And then, of course, with the bills that came afterwards, it was like, and I'm also the secretary of the California Library Association, which is a state affiliated association with ALA. And all of my colleagues, I shared the information with my colleagues about this, and that this was happening in Huntington Beach, so that they could all be aware. And so far, in California, we're a little bit, I think, it's less likely to happen in some of our communities, but so far, we've got a good network, and so far nothing's happened at the state level or the local level beyond this round of complaints that I received.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think it's interesting that you were able to mentor and guide the young teen librarian through this, kind of her first challenge. My director at the time when I went through the challenge also was very supportive and mentoring for me. It's a relationship that she will never forget. Do you have any advice that you had shared with her that you could share with our attendees?
Yeah, with my young staff members, they get really concerned that I thought that the person who's complaining was complaining about them, and I've always reassured my staff that no, I know you're trained, and I know you know what the policy and the process is. You did fine. You did what you needed to do. This isn't what happened. Wasn't personal. What you said didn't make this happen. These individuals came in with an agenda. It wasn't really about you, it was about their agenda. So you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You followed the process and the procedure. You gave them an opportunity to be heard. It's good work. And if anything like this happens again, feel free to come and talk to me immediately or as soon as you can. I'm happy to go over it with you, and it just providing that support and reassurance, and that sense that it really isn't about them so much as it is about the individual making the complaint and the agenda that they're bringing to the complaint. It's that sometimes can be really hard for essentially when you're young, and new in the profession. It can be really intimidating when somebody's right in your face, but the more you reassure and the more you remember that it isn't personal, that there is an agenda behind this, and that you just happen to represent the institution that they're targeting, it can help, and it helps I think younger and newer staff members feel a little bit more confident. And then, obviously practice helps a lot, but helping them by reassuring them about that it's not you. There's an agenda here. Really made a difference.
That's really valuable. You did a good job. You're doing a good job, because that confidence and that experience, knowing our professional values and having that code of ethics, that's not necessarily born in everybody. You have to, that has to be encouraged and nurtured to recognize that these are our values, and to be supported in making decisions. It's not easy, and like to what Tom said, it's a tough decision. It's incredibly stressful, but being told you're doing a good job is really important. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Shannon, I want to switch to the school perspective. You've done an extensive amount of research on censorship, and one of your papers was published in the Journal of Research on Libraries and Young Adults, and it focused on LGBTQ students and the bullying and harassment that takes place in schools. Could you walk us through some of your key findings of that research and the ways educators are responding to bullying and supporting LGBTQ students in the libraries?
Absolutely, and thank you for letting me have the opportunity to talk about my research. First, I want to note that virtually every school has LGBT students in it. And even if you can make an argument that a school doesn't have LGBTQIA students, it's likely that the heterosexual students know of LGBTQIA folks. So there are numerous reasons to have books and other resources that speak to these communities available in schools. And what I did was interview school librarians, and I found generally strong support for collecting and including LGBTQ materials in school libraries. They talked about meeting the needs of diverse students and including diverse materials as a way of serving their communities, especially as a way of combating the bullying and harassment that students might face. Librarians said things like, these students rely on the library, or I view my library as an island for misfit toys. They can come here and feel welcome and included. And collecting materials like LGBTQ books is a way to explicitly make them feel welcome and included. And I think that that sense of inclusivity, that drive to make people feel welcome and respected, celebrated, included, is an essential part of librarianship, not only in school libraries, but in public libraries as well.
Yes, definitely. I really appreciate kind of on a professional basis just how important your research is. I think we need more of it in order to, when I talk with librarians like Stephanie and Tom, and they're looking for resources, the research that you're doing and the publications that I can use then to share with them to help support their defense of the materials is so valuable. And there's a lot of stuff for in schools, but not necessarily always for public libraries. And so just, you know, continuing to do that research so that we have these defensive items that we can use to really support our stance is really important. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's research I enjoy doing, and I agree that it's really important. And I will definitely continue to do more in public libraries so that we have research to support the great work that our public librarians are doing.
Yes. So we've got a number of questions from members in our audience and a couple of other just general questions, and this is kind of open for anybody who wants to respond. So just kind of see what you guys are thinking. This is a question more directed at Stephanie and Tom as librarians. Do you have librarians on your staff that identify as LGBT? She says that they say that they are, and even though it isn't personal, it can feel like it when it's your identity. So have you dealt with this, and how would you respond?
Tom, we do have LGBTQIA staff, and I've had staff at every location where I've worked that self-identify in that community. And I have friends, and yeah, that makes the reassurance that much more important, because again, yeah, I also message to my staff consistently, even regardless of challenges, is that bullying is not something that you have to put up with as a staff member. Yeah, if someone appears to be coming at you, if you feel unsafe, it's fine to ask for help and to ask for someone to come and help you and assist you, either me or any of my managers or supervisors. That's fun, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And that sometimes can make a big difference too, but that's just my experience.
I'm the director of a much smaller public library, and in the past we did have a staff member who was openly lesbian, and she did receive a couple rude comments that weren't directed at her but were said in her presence. And after that, I told everyone, you don't need to tolerate that at all. Just let me know. We'll ask that person to leave. and she wore a rainbow pin, rainbow sticker. Some of the other staff wore them as well when they did. You know, I don't know that anyone's staff is now. I like them to think that they, you know, I don't tolerate any sort of harassment, and like Stephanie said, and they need to know that and we talk about that a lot, if you're not comfortable with the situation, get out of there and let me know, or let the assistant director know, and we'll go up front and deal.
I'd just like to add, this is Shannon again. As an open lesbian, when I'm researching these sorts of issues, sometimes it is pretty personal. Sometimes it does resonate on a personal level. Involved with a research group right now that's looking at drag queen story times. And as part of this project, we've interviewed librarians who have hosted drag queen story times and librarians who are opposed to drag queen story times, some of who are violently opposed to drag queen story times. And as you can imagine, some of those conversations have gotten pretty uncomfortable. But I take two sort of things with me when I have those conversations. One is that I'm a huge proponent of intellectual freedom, to the point where I think people can have these views that are really offensive and even contradictory, you know, to the things that I believe in. People have the right to believe these really different things, even though it's sometimes painful to me. And the other thing, the second belief that I have is that I have no way of changing their mind or bringing about any sort of change if I don't know their position and understand their position. So I have to hear at least a little bit of their side of their perspective before I can attempt to have a dialogue. Now, that's not the case for everybody. Sometimes that dialogue is too painful or too intense for folks. I'm not saying everybody has to go there, but that's been my perspective.
Shannon, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody off. This is a question from an audience member directed to Sarah Kate. When dealing with journalists who are determined to find the other side, how can library workers work with that kind of mentality, or that, you know, that there are two sides to every story or two different positions? We get this question a lot with like displays. Like if you have a pride display, you should also have a straight display? But yeah.
Well, I mean, I just want to say to that one, because we've dealt with a lot of these like straight parades, and you know, if straight people needed a parade, every day is their parade. So I would say every day is straight day at the library. Congrats. So you know, I think when a journalist is looking for and digging for a story, and I deal with them all the time with them, they have oftentimes created a narrative in their head, and they're just talking to you to get the proof points that they need for that narrative. It happens often, but stick with your script. Don't go off of your script, because then you will bring them to that narrative. So and it happens, I deal with this all the time, where they're coming to me about any host of a topic, any different topic, and they have what they think is they've already concluded. They've written the story in their mind. They're just slotting me in as a support point, but I won't give them that support point. So, and the way to do that is very similar to what I was talking about earlier, which is find what your points are. Talk about why diversity and inclusion. Talk about why all access is important, and that viewpoints, all viewpoints are important and need to be respected to an extent. But also, we're also talking about marginalized communities. We're talking about communities who, you know, I joke that every day is straight day at the library, but it is LGBTQ are a marginalized community. And I would also, you know, there are great stats. We have them on our website. I can get them to y'all, but, you know, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. You know, when you look at COVID-19 and how it's disproportionately affecting the LGBTQ community, both in illness and in unemployment, our community is always on sort of the brink or marginalized. And so we, you know, it's really important that when we are represented, it's fair and accurate, and that we are represented because we are marginalized. And so it's less about, I would say, thinking that there's another side of the story and really developing the side of the story that you're telling and what is important to you and what's important to the library, and especially you as the director or staff member of the library, the values of the library. I mean, access, I just think that's, you know, I love that, talking about giving everyone access. And that's the foundation. And so in order to achieve that, you need to be inclusive. It's just it's a founding principle of the library. And so I really think sticking with what you're trying to convey and why will get them off of that oftentimes.
Thank you. I think we have one more question. I want to get a piece of advice from each of you. We all represent different backgrounds and areas of expertise, from authors and media experts to library directors and lawyers. And so I'd like to ask each one of you a piece of advice that you can share with our audience from where you're coming from about defending access to these representations and these stories, these viewpoints that is so important. Stevie, do you want to go first? I want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I guess I have a different a little bit of a different perspective on like myself growing up as a Asian American kid in a pretty rural area of California, and I just always felt like I was alone and didn't have too many people to connect with, and I didn't see myself represented in a lot of children's books when I was growing up. So I'm really happy that I'm able to be a part of making that better overall and creating more inclusive content for children. So I guess my recommendation would be just if you are an artist and or a writer or any one in the creative field, do what is natural, feels natural to you. And even though you think that your story might be just personal to you, someone out there will relate to it in some way.
One thing that I recommend is starting on a personal level. You don't have to stand on the steps of your state house and make a big speech. But if you know a kid who's struggling, who's shy, who maybe needs a handout, talk to that kid. Offer that kid a book. Sit and talk with the kid. Connect the kid to somebody else. You can start on a one-on-one level and make a difference. And sometimes that difference is incredibly powerful.
I love that. I'll just add to that the books that you give access to change lives. They change hearts and minds. Not only do they affirm and validate LGBTQ people, but people who might not be accepting can have their hearts and minds changed from it. So it's such an important role that you have in helping accelerate acceptance for the LGBTQ community. And when we accelerate acceptance, we live safer lives. We don't have to worry as much about getting fired from our jobs or being denied services. And so I say, do what you're doing. Thank you for being here and for listening to these fabulous speakers about how to be inclusive in your library and in your district. I really appreciate it. And I share Shannon's sentiment, which is, it just takes one act, really, to change a heart, to change a mind, to have somebody feel validated in who they are. So thank you.
I'll build on that from a legislative standpoint. You know, develop relationships with your local representatives, your state representatives. Develop a position of trust with them, and be firm in your own messaging and your defense of diversity and inclusion as part of the library's mission, so that when these activist groups come in and try to influence policy, they trust you. When you have a relationship of trust with those folks, they'll come to you for advice, they'll rely on you. And so, you know, again, it's that personal relationship that can often turn the tide in favor of what you're doing to keep inclusive and diverse books in the library.
I think the process is important. You know your library's collection development policy and why you have diverse books. Be prepared to speak on that, and then know your process for reconsideration. If you have a grasp of those, it will help a lot.
Yeah, and I think, you know, staying true to our ethics and values as librarians and libraries. Libraries are for everyone. We need to make sure that everyone feels included and safe, and you know, and part of our community, because they are part of our community. So if you stay true to that, know your process, know your policies, do your work on inclusion and equity, then you're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to throw in my own little piece of advice, which is report censorship so that we can continue to hear these stories. It's all so valuable, and to be able to stop and learn from Stephanie and from Tom, and to hear the expert advice from Deborah and from Sarah Kate is just so valuable. And Shannon, for all of the research that you're doing. Whether your library is fully prepared with sound policies and a strong foundation of professional values, or you're vulnerable and you're isolated, support is available. Whether you're calling OIF or GLAAD or any other, or your state organizations, our challenges can be reported confidentially. It doesn't matter who reports it or when. Support from OIF is tailored to the specific school, the community, and the situation. But we can't support if we don't know about it. Only 3 to 11% of challenges are reported. So last year in 2019, we had upwards of 377 challenges recorded. And that means as many as 12,000 challenges happened that nobody knows about. So reports of challenges and censorship really can help everybody. We use this information to track trends and to strategically develop resources that can help the profession in protecting intellectual freedom. So even in situations when support isn't needed, that the situation where action can't be taken, we're always available for emotional support and listening. There are a lot of resources here on the ALA Challenge support pages, as well as intellectual freedom pages. We cultivate a comprehensive library of information and core documents on privacy, censorship, professional ethics, the First Amendment, academic freedom, privacy, equitable access, meeting rooms, filtering, minors, to support all of this amazing work and to continue the work of the research that's going on. I would just ask to please consider purchasing some of our newly released Banned Books Week merchandise. We have both posters and bookmarks, t-shirts, bracelets, not to mention some of our fantastic evergreen products like the Library Bill of Rights poster or Censored Authors infographic poster. We have tote bags and bumper stickers, and all of this merchandise supports our core values of intellectual freedom and privacy, and it also can help support the frontline workers who need it the most. I just want to let everybody know that our next webinar that's coming up is called The Shifting Landscape of Challenges, and that will be on Thursday, May 28th at 1 p.m. This webinar is co-sponsored with the Freedom to Read Foundation, and it's with the author and librarian Val Nye, and her new book shares censorship stories and highlights current challenges arising from LGBTQI materials, the Me Too movement, and books addressing racial and social justice. And Tom, if I'm not mistaken, this is where your chapter is, correct?
That's right. Buy the book.
So buy the book. It's fantastic. So I just want to say thank you again for sharing your time with us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this conversation. This was incredibly valuable, and I really appreciate it. So please be kind to one another and stay safe.